Muscle metabolism. We mentioned that our muscle contraction requires ATP. So, how do we derive the ATP necessary for the contraction cycle? There are three ways: through creatinine phosphate, through anaerobic glycolysis, and through cellular respiration. Creatinine phosphate will utilize creatinine kinase, an enzyme, to catalyze the transfer of a phosphate group from the creatinine phosphate to a DP, the diphosphate, to create a TP, our triphosphate. And this will create or rapidly creates ATP. Now, creatinine phosphate is unique to muscle fibers. This only provides us a short duration of energy, maybe about 15 seconds. Some people will supplement creatinine into their bodies, and so this creatinine supplementation is controversial because we're not sure about the effectiveness of it. Some studies show improvement in performance during short bursts like sprinting, and other studies don't show any improvement in performance. However, we do know that it does, by taking exogenous creatinine phosphate, it does decrease the body's ability to produce creatinine phosphate naturally. Also, it can lead to dehydration. And so dehydration can lead to kidney dysfunction. Anaerobic glycolysis is another way in which we can generate ATP. In this, we'll take glucose and convert it into pyruvic acid to generate ATP. So this is anaerobic, meaning that it can occur even if oxygen is not present. We create pyruvic acid, and then from this process, though, we also create a lactic acid. Lactic acid, oftentimes after we finish exercising, is still present in our blood, and so it's often thought to be what causes our muscle soreness, that buildup of lactic acid. But remember, this is the process that occurs if we don't have oxygen in the muscles. So after we have depleted the oxygen supply, oftentimes this is the process that helps us continue to generate ATP until we are able to better provide oxygen to the muscle. And once we are able to provide oxygen to the muscle, we are able to go through cellular respiration. In cellular respiration, we produce large amounts of ATP. So here it's about 30 or 32, whereas the other creatinine phosphate and our anaerobic glycolysis, both of those only produced about 2 molecules of ATP each. So with aerobic glycolysis, with muscular activity that lasts longer than 30 seconds, we can go through this process and we'll have ATP production involving the complete oxidation of glucose via the cellular respiration process. So we actually will take the pyruvic acid from glycolysis and put it into the Krebs cycle. And this will provide us with enough ATP for prolonged activity so that we can have sufficient oxygen and nutrients available. So this will be more so for our endurance type of things, sports or exercise. And so, as we mentioned, muscle fatigue is going to be when the muscles are no longer able to maintain the strength of the contraction or tension. And so we know that inadequate release of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum can contribute to that, as well as depletion of our creatinine, phosphate, oxygen, and other nutrients, the buildup of lactic acid and ADP, as well as insufficient release of acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction. All of these things can lead to us having muscle fatigue. Now, central fatigue, on the other hand, this is a change due to or change in the central nervous system, and generally this will happen and it tries to stop us from exercising. So it's pretty much our brain's way of signaling before we actually reach that muscle fatigue. After we exercise, we generally will continue to breathe heavily for a while. And this is because we need to replenish the creatinine phosphate stores. We also need to try and convert that lactate or that lactic acid into pyruvate so that it doesn't build up and cause our muscle soreness. And we also want to reload some oxygen onto the myoglobin in the muscle fibrils so that it is there the next time we get ready to contract our muscle. So our myoglobin contains a storage of oxygen that the muscle can utilize. So we continue to breathe heavily after we've exercised. Now, muscle tension, this is going to be the strength of we know that our strength of our contraction depends on how many motor units we actually activate. So remember, a motor unit is going to be a somatic motor neuron and the muscle fibers that it innervates. So it is this entire neuromuscular junction and the surrounding fibers. So if we activate only a few motor units, then generally we'll produce a weak muscle contraction. Whereas if we activate many motor units, we will generally be able to produce a strong muscle contraction. Each motor unit has an average of about 150 fibers that will be innervated by the motor neuron. We have our twitch contraction, which is going to be the brief contraction of all of those fibers in the motor unit in response to a single action potential. And so we have the latent period, which will be the delay following the action potential and the onset of the actual contraction. Then there's the contraction period where calcium binds to troponin and we have our peak contraction developed. And in the relaxation period, calcium will be transported back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And finally, the refractory period is where we lose the excitability. When we go through this stimulation, how often or how frequent we stimulate can result in changes to the tension. So when we have wave summation, which we'll show in the next slide, this occurs when we have a second action potential triggered before the first contraction has actually finished. And so this generally will give us a stronger contraction. So here you see our single action potential creating that twitch contraction. We said that brief contraction of all of the fibers. But here we see wave summation. So before this first action potential finishes, we have another action potential. And so the forcefulness of the contraction has increased. Now we introduce unfused tetanus and fused tetanus here. So this will be when we have a sustained but wavering contraction. And so when the tetanus, that's when the tetanus is unfused. So we see it's still wavering, but we get multiple or sustained contraction. Now, when it becomes fused, it's no longer wavering, and so we cannot detect the individual twitches in the muscle. We know that we have separate action potentials, but we can't actually detect those in the contraction. So we said that the more motor units we have, the stronger the contraction. So then we try to recruit more motor units so that we can increase the active number of motor units. We'll generally go and recruit the weakest ones first, then the stronger ones. So basically, if you can build yourself to be stronger by recruiting the weak, the muscle has figured out that it can have a stronger contraction. And so we take these motor units and we will allow them then to contract alternatingly to sustain our contractions for longer periods of time. Now, even when we're at rest, our skeletal muscles will exhibit a small amount of tension. That's what we call tone. So this is what helps us keep ourselves upright. This tone will be established by the alternating involuntary action of small groups of motor units in a muscle. We have isotonic and isometric contractions. So iso will always mean same. And so here we will either be talking about the tension or the muscle length. So isotonic refers to the same tension where the muscle length will change, and isometric refers to the same length but a change in tension because of we're contracting the muscle. So isotonic, where we keep the tension constant but change the length of the muscle, will either be concentric or eccentric. In concentric isotonic contraction, the length of the muscle will shorten and the object will be moved. So here we shorten the length, but we move an object. So the example here is picking up a book. And of course, then the opposite would be eccentric when we increase the length of the muscle during the contraction. So we are lowering the book now. And isometric, we actually have no movement of the book. So we're holding it steady, but the muscle has to contract because, as we know, even if we don't have a book in our hand, we just have our arm out there. Over time, it seems as if our hand is getting heavy or our arm is getting heavy, and so that's because our muscle is contracting. Now, the skeletal muscle fibers, we have a couple of different types. So we have slow oxidative fibers, fast glycolytic fibers, and fast oxidative glycolytic fibers. We have a table on the next slide that will show us comparisons, but we'll just talk about these here. The slow oxidative fibers here, they are great for endurance. So they're smaller, They're a darker red color, and this is because they have increased myoglobin content. So remember that myoglobin is the oxygen source, so oxidative in the name. And myoglobin, darker color. Our hemoglobin in our blood provides that dark red color, so the myoglobin has a dark red color because it contains the oxygen. And they're also fatigue resistant, hence why they're good for endurance activities. The fast oxidative glycolytic fibers, they're intermediate in size. They're also a darker red, and they're moderately resistant to fatigue. And then the fast glycolytic fibers here, these are good for our strength training. So they have a low myoglobin content. We have very few blood capillaries in them, and they appear lighter or white in color. So these fast oxidative glycolytic fibers are good for walking and sprinting. And the fast glycolytic are good for strength training, whereas the oxidative are good for endurance. You can see this is a cross section here, our transverse section of a muscle, and we have all three types of the fibers in there. So our skeletal muscle will be a mixture of all of those types. The distribution, though, and the recruitment, though, will differ with the fibers. And so within a motor unit, we'll have all muscle fibers of the same type. So as we think about exercise in our skeletal muscle tissue, what type of fiber will a marathoner most heavily rely on versus a shot putter or a soccer player? As far as stretching goes, stretching is going to be most effective when we have already warmed the muscles. Therefore, it's important to warm up. So oftentimes a person will do a little jog or a little bit of the activity at a lower intensity level and then stretch. And this is because we know that it's most effective when we've already warmed the muscles. It can actually be, more harmful or detrimental to stretch if the muscles have not been warmed. That's how you can strain or pull the muscles. And then I'd also like to introduce here dynamic stretches versus static stretching. So static stretching would be if you just bend over and touch your toes and you're staying still and you're not moving. Dynamic stretching is where instead of bending over to touch your toes, you might do a series of lunges to try and get a little deeper, or you might do leg swings or something of that nature so that you are actively moving and it's dynamic, but it's still stretching the muscles. And then finally, strength training will be the process of exercising a muscle and adding resistance so that we can strengthen the musculoskeletal system. Strength training also increases our bone strength. It also leads to increased muscle mass, and by increasing our muscle mass, we are able to increase our resting metabolism, and so then we're able to burn more calories at a resting rate than we were before. Now, a clinical connection here will be anabolic steroids, or when oftentimes athletes will take steroids so that they can increase their muscle size. And so the steroids will mimic testosterone and will increase the muscle size by increasing the synthesis of the proteins in the muscles. Next, we'll talk briefly about cardiac muscle tissue and smooth muscle tissue. Very briefly, though, because these sections will have larger units or chapters later. But cardiac muscle will contain intercalated disc. These intercalated discs will be unique to the cardiac muscle tissue. But other than that, cardiac muscle has the same arrangement as skeletal muscles. And the intercalated disc will have desmosomes and gap junctions. And these will allow the muscle action potential to spread from one muscle fiber to another. Cardiac muscle has more mitochondria than skeletal muscle, and the contractions in cardiac muscle will last 10 to 15 times longer than skeletal muscle. So here we see the intercalated disc. We still see the striations. Now smooth muscle. Smooth muscle looks quite different from our cardiac and our skeletal muscle. It'll either be arranged as a single unit or a multi-unit fiber. In a single unit fiber, it contracts as one, similar to our cardiac muscle, whereas in a multi-unit, it will consist of individual fibers that contract independently. The contractions will start more slowly in smooth muscle but last longer, and it can shorten and stretch to a greater extent than our skeletal and cardiac muscle. It also shortens in response to stretch. The filaments in the smooth muscle will be connected to structures called dense bodies, which are functionally similar to the Z-disc. So it doesn't have Z-disc, but it does have dense bodies. And we also here have intermediate filaments. So we have the thick and the thin filaments, but we also have intermediate filaments. Our muscles will be thick in the middle, and as you see, they taper to the end. So we have the relaxation, and then we have the contraction. This contraction and relaxation are regulated by calmodulin and myosin light chain kinase. We have certain hormones that can also influence the state of contraction. How does our muscle regenerate? Well, mature skeletal muscle fibers cannot actually undergo mitosis. We have hypertrophy and hyperplasia. So both are increases, but hypertrophy is actually an increase in the size of the cell. So the existing cells will enlarge to create hypertrophy, whereas hyperplasia is an increase in the number of muscle fibers. And smooth muscle will have pericytes that will help it to regenerate. As we age, we will undergo a slow progressive loss of skeletal muscle mass. And instead of being skeletal muscle, it will be replaced by fibrous connective tissue and adipose tissue. Between the ages of 30 and 50 years, we have about 10% of our muscle tissue being replaced by the fibrous connective tissue and adipose tissue. And then between 50 and 80 years, we have another 40% being replaced. So the consequences of muscle tissue being replaced by fibrous connective tissue and adipose tissue is that our muscle strength and flexibility will decrease, our reflexes slow, and the number of slow oxidative fibers actually increase. Generally, our lower limbs will atrophy before our upper limbs. Now, as far as disorders of the muscular system, we have myasthenia gravis, muscular dystrophy, and then we have some abnormal contractions that will occur as well. So, myasthenia gravis is an autoimmune disorder that's characterized by great muscular weakness, and it's caused by antibodies directed against the acetylcholine receptors at the neuromuscular junction. As the disease progresses, more acetylcholine receptors are affected, making the muscle increasingly weaker. So it is a progressive disease. Muscular dystrophy will be an inherited muscle destroying disease or group of diseases that are characterized by degeneration of individual muscle fibers, leading to progressive atrophy of the skeletal muscle. And so the most common form here is this Duchenne muscular dystrophy, for which there's actually hope that gene therapy may someday be employed to replace the responsible gene with one that halts the muscle loss. And then our abnormal contractions, spasm, cramp, tic, tremor, fasciculation, and fibrillation. Please be sure just to know the definition of those.